The art of disappearing. Eleanor Hartwell had learned through 19 years of careful practice and painful necessity, required more than simply occupying forgotten corners of Ashford Manor, or moving through corridors with the silent efficiency of a ghost whose presence disturbed no one, and whose absence registered even less in the consciousness of those who shared the house but never truly saw her. True invisibility demanded the systematic erasure of anything that might draw attention or provoke notice, the suppression of laughter that came too loud or too genuine, the careful modulation of footsteps that might echo in ways that announced arrival or departure, the deliberate cultivation of plainness in dress and manner and expression so complete that eyes slid past without catching on any detail memorable enough to lodge in observers' minds and prompt later recognition or recall. She had perfected this art under the tutelage of her stepmother, Lady Vivienne, who had made abundantly clear from the moment she married Eleanor's father 12 years earlier that his daughter from his first marriage represented an embarrassment to be managed and minimized, a reminder of the modest country gentleman Lady Vivienne had married for his comfortable income and respectable name, rather than for love or genuine regard, and whose continued existence in the household served only to highlight the fact that Lady Vivienne's own daughter Rosalind, beautiful and accomplished, and everything Eleanor was not, had to share a home with living evidence that her mother had married down from the aristocratic heights she believed herself born to occupy. Eleanor's father had died when she was 11, carried off by a fever that swept through the county with devastating efficiency, and his death had transformed her from beloved daughter, whose every accomplishment earned paternal pride, into unwanted burden, whose presence Lady Vivienne tolerated only because the terms of Mr. Hartwell's will required that his daughter be housed and maintained until she reached her majority or married, whichever came first. The will had also stipulated that funds be set aside for Eleanor's education and development, particularly for the artistic training her father had recognized as her singular talent and greatest joy. But Lady Vivienne had found ways to ensure those funds were redirected toward Rosalind's extensive wardrobe and music master, and all the expensive trappings required to launch a young woman of ambition into society with every possible advantage. Eleanor had learned not to ask about the painting lessons her father had learned not to mention the art supply that had once filled the small studio her father had created, had learned that mentioning what had been taken from her only resulted in Lady Vivienne's cold lectures about gratitude and proper appreciation for the generosity of a stepmother who could have easily sent her to live with distant relations or found some other means of disposing of an unwanted charge. But Eleanor had not stopped painting, despite Lady Vivienne's explicit prohibition against wasting time and resources on such frivolous pursuits, when there were useful tasks to be completed and household duties that required attention. She had simply learned to paint in secret, using whatever materials she could scavenge or create: charcoal from the kitchen fires, pigments made from crushed berries and flowers, paper salvaged from the waste bins where Lady Vivienne discarded correspondence and accounts. Her sanctuary was the walled garden at the far edge of the estate ground, a space that had been her mother's special project before her death when Eleanor was 7, and which had fallen into romantic decay over the intervening years, becoming overgrown and wild and forgotten by everyone except Eleanor, who had claimed it as her private refuge where she could spend stolen hours capturing faces on paper, practicing the portrait work that had always fascinated her more than landscapes, or still, life's, trying to learn through observation and experiment what formal lessons might have taught her if Lady Vivienne had not destroyed that possibility, along with so many others. She had been working on a portrait that, a self-port, though she would never have admitted such vanity if discovered, trying to capture not her physical features, which she knew were unremarkable in every way that mattered to people like Lady Vivienne, who valued beauty as currency in the marriage market, but rather something of the interior life that existed beneath the carefully cultivated invisibility. Some evidence that Eleanor Hartwell possessed thoughts and feelings and desires, beyond the mechanical performance of duties and the careful avoidance of notice. The face emerging on the salvaged paper was not pretty in conventional terms, but it was alive, animated by an intensity of expression that Eleanor never permitted herself to display in the presence of others, and she had been so absorbed in the work that she failed to hear Lady Vivienne's approach until her stepmother's voice, cold and sharp as a blade, shattered the garden's peace and Eleanor's fragile sense of safety. "So this is where you disappear to, when there are tasks requiring completion in the house," Lady Vivienne said, her tone carrying that particular quality of controlled fury that Eleanor had learned to dread more than open rage because it promised punishment delivered with calculated precision rather than in the heat of immediate anger. This is where you waste time and materials on your pathetic scribblings, while Rosalind practices her piano and perfects the accomplishments that will secure her an advantageous marriage. Did I not explicitly forbid you from engaging in this frivolous pursuit? Did I not make clear that every moment of your time and every resource of this household must be directed toward useful purposes rather than indulgent fantasies? Eleanor had risen from her seat on the stone bench, the portrait clutched in her trembling hands, and attempted to stammer some explanation or apology. But Lady Vivienne had not waited for responses that would have been inadequate regardless of their content. She had simply strode forward and torn the portrait from Eleanor's grip, with enough force to rip the paper, then proceeded to methodically destroy the image Eleanor had spent 3 hours creating, ripping it into smaller and smaller pieces, while Eleanor watched with tears streaming down her face and her throat closed around protests she knew better than to voice aloud. "You will take these pieces to the kitchen," Lady Vivienne had commanded, when the portrait existed only as fragments scattered across the garden's overgrown flagstones, "and you will burn them in the cooking fire where they belong, as evidence of the worthlessness of your efforts and the foolishness of believing yourself capable of creating anything of value. Then, you will scrub the kitchen floors and polish the silver in the dining room and complete all the other tasks I have assigned to you today, and you will never again waste time on this ridiculous painting nonsense. Do you understand me, Eleanor? Never again. If I discover you have disobeyed this direct command, I will ensure that you understand the full extent of my displeasure in ways that will make today's lesson seem mild by comparison." Eleanor had gathered the torn pieces of her portrait with shaking hands, had carried them through the house to the kitchen, where the cook had watched with pitying eyes as Eleanor fed her work into the flames piece by piece, watching 3 hours of careful effort reduced to ash and smoke, while something inside her chest seemed to burn along with the paper, some spark of hope or resilience that had survived 12 years of Lady Vivienne's systematic cruelty, but which could not withstand this particular destruction. She had completed all her assigned tasks with mechanical efficiency, moving through the hours like one of the automatons she had read about in her father's books. And when she finally retreated to her small chamber in the servants' wing, for Lady Vivienne had long ago reassigned Eleanor's proper bedroom to storage space and moved her stepdaughter to accommodations that matched her reduced status, she had lain on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and wondered how many more years she could endure before something essential broke permanently and left her as empty as portrait's ashes. The answer had seemed particularly urgent that evening, when Lady Vivienne summoned Eleanor to the drawing room, where Rosalind sat in her customary position of prominence, and informed her in tones that brooked no argument that Duke James Thornwood would be arriving tomorrow for a 3-day visit during which he would assess Rosalind's suitability as his future Duchess, that this visit represented the culmination of months of careful planning and the potentially crowning achievement of Lady Vivienne's social ambitions, and that Eleanor would remain absolutely invisible throughout the Duke's stay, confined to her chamber or to tasks in the servants' areas where no guest would encounter her and where her unfortunate existence could not embarrass the family or cast any shadow over Rosalind's perfection. "You are to be a ghost," Lady Vivienne had said with cold precision, her eyes boring into Eleanor's with an intensity that communicated both command and threat. "You will not appear in any public rooms. You will not venture into the gardens or grounds where you might be seen. You will take your meals in your chamber or the kitchen rather than risk being observed by His Grace or any member of his party. Rosalind has worked too hard, and I have invested too much in this match to risk having it jeopardized by your presence reminding everyone that I married a man whose first wife produced such disappointing offspring. Do you understand me, Eleanor? 3 days of absolute invisibility. 3 days during which you do not exist for anyone in this house except the servants who bring you food and water. If you fail in this simple requirement, if you somehow manage to draw attention to yourself despite my explicit instructions, I will ensure that you spend the remainder of your time in this house regretting your disobedience in ways I trust I do not need to enumerate." Eleanor had nodded her understanding, had murmured the appropriate acknowledgements, had retreated to her chamber, with the familiar weight of worthlessness settling over her like a shroud, and she had tried to tell herself that 3 days was manageable, that she had survived worse humiliations and could survive this one as well, that perhaps there was even a kind of mercy in being explicitly commanded to remain invisible rather than being expected to witness Rosalind's triumph and the Duke's inevitable capitulation to her stepsister's considerable charms and carefully cultivated accomplishments. But as she prepared for sleep that night, she became aware of Mr. Pembroke, the elderly butler who had served her father, and who alone among the staff treated Eleanor with the respect her birth should have commanded, standing quietly in her doorway with something folded in his gnarled hands. "Your father would have been proud of your portrait work, Miss Eleanor," he said softly, using her proper title despite Lady Vivienne's insistence that Eleanor be addressed simply as girl or you, as if even her name represented more acknowledgement than she deserved. "I have seen some of the pieces you thought were hidden in the old potting shed. Forgive an old man's curiosity, and I want you to know that you have genuine talent, the kind that cannot be taught or cultivated, but which exists as a gift from God or nature, or whatever force determines such things. Your stepmother may forbid you from painting, but she cannot erase the ability itself or make you less than what you are, which is an artist of considerable promise whose work deserves recognition and development rather than suppression and destruction." He had placed what he carried onto Eleanor's bed, a handkerchief of fine linen, monogrammed with her father's initials, one of the few personal items Eleanor had been permitted to keep after Lady Vivienne disposed of most of Mr. Hartwell's possessions. "Keep this with you during the Duke's visit," Mr. Pembroke had continued, his voice gentle despite the sternness of his weathered features. "Keep it as a reminder that you are your father's daughter, that you possess value and worth independent of your stepmother's assessment, that 3 days of imposed invisibility cannot erase the truth of who you are or what you might become if given the opportunity to escape this house and build a life on your own terms. And Miss Eleanor," he had paused, his eyes holding hers with unusual intensity, "sometimes the very things we are commanded to hide are precisely the things that need most desperately to be seen." The transformation of Ashford Manor for the Duke's visit began before dawn and continued with frantic intensity throughout the morning. Lady Vivienne directing servants with the precision of a general marshalling troops for decisive battle, every detail scrutinized and adjusted and perfected, until the house gleamed with a splendour it had not displayed since Mr. Hartwell's funeral 12 years earlier. Rosalind had been dressed in her finest morning gown of pale pink muslin, her golden hair arranged in elaborate curls that had required 2 hours of her lady's maid's attention, her accomplishments rehearsed and her conversation coached until she could discuss art and literature and music with the superficial fluency that passed for genuine knowledge in drawing rooms where depth was less valued than the appearance of cultivation. Eleanor had been relegated to the servants' wing as promised, given a list of tasks that would keep her occupied and exhausted and safely removed from any area where the Duke might conceivably wander, and she had attacked the work with mechanical efficiency, born of long practice, polishing silver that already gleamed and scrubbing floors that showed no visible dirt, finding in physical labour a distraction from the emotional turmoil that threatened to overwhelm her if she allowed herself to think too deeply about what was occurring in the rooms above where Rosalind was being presented as perfection, and Eleanor's very existence was being denied. Duke James Thornwood arrived precisely at noon in a carriage bearing the Thornwood crest, accompanied by his valet and a minimal staff that suggested a man who valued efficiency over ostentation, despite his elevated rank and considerable fortune. He was 32 years old, tall and dark-haired, and possessed of the kind of aristocratic features that painters spent careers attempting to capture, his bearing radiating the unconscious confidence of someone born to privilege and power, but tempered by something in his expression that suggested intelligence and possibly weariness with the endless social performances his position demanded. Lady Vivienne greeted him with effusive welcome that bordered on embarrassing. Rosalind curtsied with perfect grace and murmured appropriate pleasantries in a voice carefully modulated to convey both deference and self-possession. And the Duke responded with the polite courtesy that his breeding and position required, while his eyes remained curiously flat, as if he were performing a role he had played countless times before, and which had long since ceased to engage his genuine interest or attention. The introductions concluded, Lady Vivienne suggested a tour of the gardens before luncheon, and the party proceeded outdoors into the June sunshine that painted everything in shades of gold and green, transforming Ashford Manor's carefully maintained grounds into the kind of picturesque landscape that appeared in paintings celebrating English country life and aristocratic leisure. Rosalind walked beside the Duke with perfect posture and animated conversation about the various plantings and their seasonal characteristics, demonstrating the botanical knowledge that Lady Vivienne had ensured she acquired through expensive tutors and carefully supervised study, while Lady Vivienne followed at a discreet distance that allowed the young people to converse, while ensuring propriety was maintained and nothing inappropriate occurred to jeopardize the match she had worked so long to arrange. They had nearly completed the circuit of the formal gardens when the Duke paused near the gate that led to the walled garden, his attention caught by something beyond the carefully manicured lawns and precisely trimmed hedges, some quality of wildness or authentic growth that contrasted sharply with the artificial perfection of the spaces through which they had been walking. "What lies beyond that gate?" he asked, gesturing toward the weathered wood that closed off Eleanor's sanctuary from the rest of the estate grounds. "I notice the garden appears quite different from the formal plantings we have been admiring, more natural perhaps, or simply neglected. I confess, I have always found overgrown spaces more interesting than those maintained to within an inch of perfection, more revealing of what nature intends when not constrained by human intervention." Lady Vivienne's expression had tightened with barely concealed displeasure, but she managed a smile that revealed nothing of her irritation at this departure from the planned route. "That is merely an old walled garden that has been allowed to return to a more natural state," she said dismissively, her tone suggesting the space held no interest or value worthy of a duke's attention. "It was a particular project of the first Mrs. Hartwell many years ago, but after her passing it seemed unnecessary to maintain it with the same rigour applied to the rest of the grounds. We could certainly arrange for it to be opened if your Grace wishes to view it, though I suspect you will find little of interest beyond overgrown roses and whatever weeds have colonised the space in recent years." But the Duke was already moving toward the gate with the determination of someone whose curiosity had been genuinely piqued, and Lady Vivienne had no choice but to follow along with Rosalind, whose practised smile had begun to show strain around the edges as she recognised that the Duke's attention had shifted away from her rehearsed charms towards something she had not been prepared to discuss or display. The gate opened with a protesting creak onto a scene of romantic wilderness, roses climbing over crumbling walls, foxgloves and hollyhocks growing in glorious profusion wherever seeds had found purchase, stone benches half hidden by trailing vines, and the remains of what had once been carefully planned beds now surrendered to nature's own design. And there, seated on one of those half-hidden benches, with a scrap of paper balanced on her lap and a piece of charcoal in her hand, entirely absorbed in her work and utterly unaware of the audience that had suddenly materialized at the garden's entrance, was Eleanor Hartwell, her plain dress and unadorned hair marking her immediately as someone of lesser status than the elegantly attired party observing her, but her face transformed by concentration and joy into something that arrested the Duke's attention with surprising force. He stood frozen in the gateway, watching this unknown young woman work on what appeared to be a portrait. He could see enough of the paper to recognize the genre even from a distance, her entire being focused with an intensity that suggested nothing else in the world existed beyond the image she was creating and the internal vision she was attempting to capture through charcoal and paper and sheer determined effort. "Who is that?" the Duke asked quietly, his voice carrying a quality of genuine interest that had been entirely absent during his interactions with Rosalind, and Lady Vivienne felt a spike of pure fury at Eleanor's disobedience, at her stepdaughter's presence in this space, despite explicit commands to remain invisible, at the way the Duke was looking at the girl with an attention that should have been directed exclusively toward Rosalind during these crucial 3 days of assessment and courtship. "That is merely my stepdaughter," Lady Vivienne said, investing the words with as much dismissiveness as language permitted. "A girl of no consequence whose father was my late husband. She is of a delicate constitution and generally prefers her own company to social interaction, which is why I did not think to mention her existence during our correspondence about this visit." "Eleanor!" Her voice rose sharply, cutting through the garden's peace with the force of a whip crack. "You were explicitly instructed to remain in your chamber. What are you doing in this garden, when you should be completing the tasks I assigned to you?" Eleanor had started violently at the sound of her stepmother's voice, the charcoal falling from her nerveless fingers to leave a dark mark across the portrait she had been working on, and she rose from the bench with visible trembling, her face draining of colour as she recognized not only Lady Vivienne's fury, but the presence of strangers who were witnessing her humiliation and her disobedience and her stepmother's public correction of behaviour that apparently required immediate censure. "I apologise, my lady," she managed, her voice barely audible, her eyes fixed on the ground, rather than risking meeting anyone's gaze. "I completed the silver polishing and thought I might have a few moments before the next task required my attention. But I understand I was wrong to presume such freedom, and I will return immediately to the house if you will permit me to gather my materials." "You will leave your materials where they lie," Lady Vivienne said coldly, "and you will return to your chamber immediately, where you will remain for the duration of His Grace's visit, as originally instructed. I will deal with your disobedience later, after our guests have departed, and I have time to properly address the disrespect you have shown through this flagrant violation. Now go, before you embarrass this family further with your presence." Eleanor had bent to retrieve her charcoal and paper, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped both again. But before she could gather her materials and flee as commanded, the Duke's voice stopped her with quiet authority that brooked no argument despite its gentleness. "A moment, if you please," he said, addressing Eleanor directly for the first time, and Lady Vivienne felt her carefully constructed plans beginning to unravel as the Duke walked deeper into the walled garden toward where Eleanor stood, frozen in postures of flight. "I would very much like to see what you were working on, if you would be willing to show me. I confess, I have always been interested in portraiture as an art form, and it is rare to encounter someone engaged in such work outside of formal studio settings." Eleanor looked to Lady Vivienne with desperate appeal, seeking permission, or perhaps simply guidance on how to respond to this impossible situation, and her stepmother had no choice but to smile with false warmth and nod permission for Eleanor to show the Duke her work, unable to refuse a direct request from a man whose rank and importance demanded accommodation, even when such accommodation threatened to completely destroy the carefully managed narrative Lady Vivienne had constructed about her, family, and Rosalind's perfection. Eleanor extended the paper toward the Duke with visibly trembling hands, and he took it carefully, studying the portrait she had been creating with a focus and attention that suggested genuine rather than polite interest. The image was of a face Eleanor had glimpsed in the village market weeks earlier, an elderly woman whose weathered features and bright eyes had suggested a life fully lived and stories worth hearing, though Eleanor had not spoken to her subject or sought permission for the portrait, but had simply attempted to capture from memory what she had observed in that brief encounter. The work was rough and incomplete, constrained by limited materials and lack of formal training, but it possessed a quality of vitality and authentic observation that could not be taught, an ability to see beneath surface features to something essential about character and personality that separated competent technical execution from genuine artistic vision. "This is quite remarkable," the Duke said finally, his voice carrying sincere appreciation rather than conventional politeness. "You have captured something of this woman's spirit. I can see intelligence in her eyes and humour in the set of her mouth, can sense that she has lived a full life and possesses stories worth hearing, even though I have never met her and know nothing about her beyond what your charcoal has revealed. How long have you been studying portraiture, Miss?" He paused, realizing he did not know Eleanor's name beyond stepdaughter, a designation that revealed relationship but not identity. "Eleanor Hartwell," she supplied in a whisper, her eyes still downcast, her entire body radiating the desire to disappear or flee, or simply cease existing under the weight of this unwanted attention. "And I have had no formal study, Your Grace. I simply draw what I see, or what I remember seeing, using whatever materials I can find. My father wished for me to have proper instruction, but circumstances prevented such education, and so I have learned through observation and practice, rather than through the systematic training a genuine artist would receive." "Then you possess natural talent," the Duke observed. "The kind that formal training would enhance, but which exists independently of instruction, and which reveals itself through authentic observation and genuine feeling for the subject. This woman you have drawn, I feel as if I know her, as if I could engage her in conversation and find it rewarding, simply from the way you have captured her expression, and the life you have given her through these simple lines of charcoal on scrap paper. That is a gift, Miss Hartwell, one you should not dismiss as merely drawing what you see, when what you see and how you translate it onto paper represents something far more rare and valuable than conventional technical competence. Lady Vivienne had moved closer during this exchange, her fury at Eleanor barely contained beneath a facade of maternal concern that fooled no one with functioning perception. "Your Grace is too kind," she said with false warmth, "but I must insist that Eleanor return to the house as I originally commanded. She has been unwell recently and requires rest, and I would not want her delicate constitution to be overtaxed by extended time in the sun or by the excitement of unexpected company. Eleanor, go to your chamber immediately and remain there until I come to check on you this evening." The Duke had looked between Lady Vivienne and Eleanor with an expression that suggested he understood far more than what was being explicitly stated, that the dynamic he was observing bore little resemblance to the maternal concern Lady Vivienne claimed to feel, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a quality of steel beneath its continued courtesy. "Perhaps Miss Hartwell might join us for dinner this evening," he suggested, phrasing it as a request, though the authority behind the words transformed it into something closer to command. "I would very much like to continue our conversation about portraiture and artistic observation, and it seems a shame to deprive the gathering of someone with such evident talent and interesting perspective, simply because she prefers her own company to large social events. Surely a family dinner with limited company would not overtax even a delicate constitution." Lady Vivienne's smile had become rictus-like, with the effort required to maintain pleasant appearance while her plans crumbled around her. But she could not refuse a direct request from a duke without appearing churlish or unreasonably controlling, and so she found herself agreeing that Eleanor would indeed join them for dinner, that they looked forward to the Duke continuing his conversation with stepdaughter about art and whatever other topics might interest his Grace. Eleanor had looked between the Duke and Lady Vivienne with an expression that suggested she recognized she had just become a pawn in some larger game, whose rules she did not understand, but whose stakes involved her stepmother's barely contained fury, and the Duke's unexpected interest in her worthless stepdaughter, rather than in the perfect Rosalind who had been so carefully prepared for his consideration and approval. Eleanor spent the afternoon in a state of suspended dread, waiting for Lady Vivienne to appear and deliver the punishment that her disobedience and the Duke's unfortunate discovery certainly merited. But the expected confrontation did not materialize until after the luncheon had concluded and the guests had retired to their rooms for the customary afternoon rest. Then Lady Vivienne appeared in the kitchen corridor, where Eleanor was attempting to complete the floor scrubbing she had abandoned to spend those stolen moments in the walled garden, and the cold fury in her stepmother's face left no doubt about the severity of consequences that were about to be delivered for the crime of being seen when she should have remained invisible. "You deliberate, disobedient creature!" Lady Vivienne hissed, her voice low enough not to carry beyond the corridor, but intense enough to make Eleanor flinch away from words that felt like physical blows. "I gave you explicit instructions to remain in your chamber, to be invisible throughout the Duke's visit, and you directly violated those commands by appearing in the one place where you were certain to be discovered if His Grace decided to explore the grounds. Did you plan this, Eleanor? Did you deliberately position yourself where you might be seen, hoping to draw attention and perhaps garner sympathy as the poor neglected stepdaughter whose talents are being suppressed by her wicked stepmother? Or are you simply too stupid to follow the simplest directions, too incompetent to understand that your presence threatens everything I have worked for, everything Rosalind deserves?" Eleanor tried to stammer some explanation about Mr. Pembroke sending her to gather herbs from the walled garden, about believing she had time before the touring party would reach that area of the grounds, about never intending to be seen or to cause any disruption to the Duke's visit. But Lady Vivienne was not interested in excuses or explanations that might mitigate Eleanor's culpability. She had simply drawn back her hand and struck Eleanor across the face with enough force to send her stepdaughter stumbling backward against the wall, her palm leaving a vivid red mark on Eleanor's pale cheek, and her eyes blazing with barely controlled rage that wanted to deliver far worse punishment than a single slap could accomplish. "You will remain locked in your chamber for the remainder of the Duke's visit," Lady Vivienne said with cold finality. "I will have bread and water sent up twice daily, and you will not be permitted to leave for any reason until His Grace has departed. and I have time to determine appropriate consequences for your flagrant disobedience. And Eleanor! She had leaned close, her voice dropping to something that sounded almost gentle, but which carried more threat than her previous fury. If you somehow manage to appear at dinner tonight despite my explicit prohibition, if you accept the Duke's invitation when you should refuse on grounds of illness or exhaustion, or any of a dozen other excuses that would prevent your presence, I will ensure that you spend the rest of your days in this house regretting that decision in ways I trust I do not need to enumerate. The Duke will forget you the moment he leaves Ashford Manor, will return to London and his important life, and will never spare another thought for the sad little stepdaughter with her charcoal portraits. But I will remember Eleanor, and I will make certain you pay for every moment of attention he wasted on you that should have been directed toward Rosalind. She had called for Mr. Pembroke then, instructed him to escort Eleanor to her chamber, and ensure the door was properly locked from the outside, and the old butler had complied with visible reluctance, his eyes communicating sympathy and concern that he could not express aloud without risking his own position in Lady Vivienne's hostile household. Once Eleanor was locked in her small room with only a piece of bread and a cup of water for sustenance until evening, she had collapsed onto her narrow bed and allowed herself to weep with the kind of hopeless abandon she rarely permitted, even in private, overwhelmed by the confluence of her stepmother's violence, the Duke's unexpected kindness, and the terrible awareness that for one brief moment she had been seen as something more than an invisible burden, but that such visibility would cost her dearly and change nothing about the fundamental circumstances of her powerless existence. She had no intention of attending dinner despite the Duke's invitation, understood that appearing would only escalate Lady Vivienne's fury and result in punishments far worse than being locked in her chamber with minimal food, accepted that her brief moment of being noticed would have to sustain her through whatever consequences followed from her disobedience and the Duke's unfortunate interest in her worthless artistic efforts. But an hour before dinner, Mr. Pembroke appeared at her door with a tray bearing not just bread and water but actual food, cold chicken and cheese and fruit that represented more nourishment than Eleanor typically received in an entire day, along with a dress she had never seen before, one of her mother's gowns that had been carefully preserved and which Mr. Pembroke must have retrieved from whatever storage Lady Vivienne had consigned Mrs. Hartwell's belongings to after her death. "The Duke has made it quite clear to Lady Vivienne that he expects you at dinner," Mr. Pembroke said quietly, setting the tray on Eleanor's small table and laying the dress across her bed with careful reverence. "He has, in fact, made it clear that he considers your presence essential to the success of the evening, and that he will be gravely disappointed if circumstances prevent your attendance. Lady Vivienne has been cornered into allowing your participation, though I suspect she will extract payment for this humiliation at some point after the Duke's departure. But Miss Eleanor, for tonight at least, you have been given permission to exist, to be seen, to participate in your own household, as if you possessed value and deserved consideration. I would urge you to accept this gift, however temporary, and to show the Duke and everyone else at that table exactly who you are beneath the invisibility your stepmother has forced you to cultivate." Eleanor had stared at the dress, pale green silk that had been her mother's favourite colour, and at the food that Mr. Pembroke had somehow procured despite Lady Vivienne's explicit orders for minimal sustenance, and she had felt something crack inside her chest, some protective barrier beginning to fracture under the combined assault of unexpected kindness from the old butler, an impossible intervention from a Duke who had no reason to care about the fate of an unremarkable stepdaughter with artistic pretensions and no social consequence. "I am frightened," she whispered, the admission emerging before she could prevent it, before shame at revealing weakness could silence the truth. "I am frightened of what will happen tonight at that dinner table, frightened of Lady Vivienne's plans to humiliate me in front of the Duke and prove that his interest was misplaced, frightened that I will somehow fail to be whatever he expected when he saw me in the garden, and that his disappointment will confirm every terrible thing my stepmother has ever said about my worthlessness and my lack of value." "Then be frightened," Pembroke said gently, "but attend the dinner anyway, because courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the choice to act despite terror when something important hangs in the balance. The Duke saw something in you this afternoon, Miss Eleanor, something genuine and valuable that your stepmother has worked for 12 years to erase or conceal. and he has taken the extraordinary step of ensuring you will be present tonight, so that he might see more, learn more, understand more about who you truly are, beneath the invisibility Lady Vivienne has forced upon you. Do not waste this opportunity, however frightening it may be, because such chances come rarely in lives like ours, and rarer still in lives like yours, where every possible advantage has been systematically stripped away by those who should have protected and nurtured you. Tonight, you have been given permission. No, you have been commanded to exist. Accept that command and show them all that existing is something you do remarkably well when someone actually bothers to look. Lady Vivienne had orchestrated the dinner seating with calculated precision, placing Eleanor at the far end of the long table, in the position typically reserved for least important guests, as far from the Duke as the room's geography permitted, while still technically including her in the gathering. Rosalind held the position of honor at the Duke's right hand, arranged like a perfect jewel in sapphire silk that matched her eyes and emphasized the golden perfection of her carefully styled hair, while Lady Vivienne commanded the head of the table from which she could oversee the entire gathering and ensure that conversation flowed according to her careful planning. The other guests, two families from neighboring estates who had been invited to witness Rosalind's triumph, had been positioned strategically to maximize Rosalind's opportunities to display her accomplishments while minimizing any possibility that Eleanor might attract sustained attention despite her presence. Before the dinner commenced, Lady Vivienne had carefully primed the other guests with whispered observations about Eleanor's delicate nerves and occasional confusion, about the tragedy of Mr. Hartwell's first wife dying when Eleanor was so young and leaving the girl without proper maternal guidance, about Lady Vivienne's patient attempts to help her stepdaughter develop into someone capable of basic social functioning, despite the challenges Eleanor's temperament presented. The groundwork was laid for public humiliation disguised as maternal concern, for questions that would expose Eleanor's lack of formal education and accomplishments, for comparisons between Rosalind's perfection and Eleanor's inadequacy that would make abundantly clear which daughter deserved admiration and which warranted only pity or dismissal. Eleanor entered the dining room wearing her mother's green silk gown, her hair arranged in the simple style she managed herself without the benefit of a lady's maid, her face still bearing faint marks from Lady Vivienne's slap, though she had done her best to minimize their visibility through careful positioning and the dim candlelight. She paused in the doorway for just a moment, gathering courage from Mr. Pembroke's words and from the handkerchief she had tucked into her sleeve, feeling every eye in the room turned toward her, and hearing the sudden silence that fell as the assembled company registered her presence and her unexpected appearance, despite the prior suggestions that she was too unwell or too delicate to participate in such gatherings. The Duke had been the first to move, rising from his chair with such immediate courtesy that the other gentlemen had no choice but to follow suit, and he had walked the length of the table to where Eleanor stood with her heart pounding and her hands trembling, and her entire body radiating the desperate desire to flee back to her locked chamber where no one could see her or judge her or find her wanting. "Miss Hartwell," he said warmly, offering his arm with the same courtesy he might have extended to a lady of highest rank, "I am delighted you were able to join us this evening. I have been looking forward to continuing our conversation about portraiture and artistic observation, and I confess the prospect of discussing such topics with someone who practices the art adds considerably to my anticipation of the evening ahead." He had escorted Eleanor to her assigned seat at the table's far end, but before releasing her arm, he had addressed Lady Vivienne with polite directness that nonetheless carried unmistakable command. "Lady Vivienne, I wonder if we might rearrange the seating slightly to accommodate my preference for continuing my conversation with Miss Hartwell throughout dinner. Perhaps she might be seated nearer to my position, where we could converse more easily without requiring raised voices across the table's length." The request was phrased as question, but delivered with the authority of someone accustomed to having preferences accommodated regardless of prior arrangements, and Lady Vivienne had no choice but to agree with false graciousness, while her eyes promised Eleanor that this public overturning of carefully planned seating would be added to the growing list of offences requiring eventual punishment. The table was rearranged, Eleanor finding herself positioned directly across from the Duke, with Rosalind moved slightly down the table and looking increasingly perplexed and displeased by this disruption of her mother's careful planning, and her own anticipated triumph. Throughout the first course, the Duke engaged Eleanor in genuine conversation, rather than the performative questioning that characterized most social dining, asking about her artistic process and her choice of subjects, about what drew her to portraiture specifically, rather than landscapes or still lifes, about how she managed to create anything approaching finished work, with such limited materials, and no formal instruction to guide her technique, or help her understand principles of proportion and composition. Eleanor answered hesitantly at first, hyper-aware of Lady Vivienne's watchful presence and the other guests' curious attention, but the Duke's obvious interest and his thoughtful follow-up questions gradually drew her out of protective silence, and she found herself speaking with more animation and confidence than she had displayed in years about the things she observed in faces, about the way certain expressions revealed character and history, about her fascination with elderly subjects whose features bore physical evidence of lives fully lived and experiences that had shaped them into who they had become. "I confess I envy you for your observational skills," the Duke said during a pause while the second course was being served. "I have sat for numerous portraits over the years and have always felt that the artists, however technically accomplished, somehow failed to capture anything essential about who I am beyond the superficial facts of my features and my title. They paint the Duke of Thornwood rather than James Thornwood, if you understand the distinction. They capture the role I inhabit, rather than the person beneath the performance. I wonder if you might be able to see past the trappings to whatever actually exists underneath, or if the title and the position have become so thoroughly integrated into my being that there is no longer any meaningful separation between the role and the reality." "I suspect everyone contains multitudes," Eleanor replied quietly, "layers that remain hidden from casual observers, but which reveal themselves to those who care to look with genuine attention, rather than simply processing surface impressions and moving on to the next subject. The challenge in portraiture is not technical execution, but rather the ability to see clearly, to observe without the distortions that expectations and prejudice impose, to capture something authentic about the subject, even when that authenticity conflicts with what we believe we should be seeing based on external markers like rank or beauty or social performance." Something in the Duke's expression shifted at those words, some quality of surprise or perhaps recognition crossing his features, and when he responded, his voice carried weight beyond the simple dinner conversation they appeared to be conducting. "And what do you see when you look at me, Miss Hartwell? If you were to draw my portrait, what would you attempt to capture beyond the obvious facts of my appearance?" Eleanor met his gaze directly for perhaps the first time since entering the dining room, and she studied his face with the same focused attention she brought to her portrait, seeing past the aristocratic beauty of his features to something else, a quality of loneliness or perhaps weariness, the particular expression of someone who had learned to perform his role flawlessly while remaining profoundly disconnected from most of what that performance required. "I would try to capture the way your eyes change when you speak about things that genuinely interest you versus when you are simply being polite," she said slowly, thinking through her observations even as she articulated. "There is a difference in quality, a kind of lighting that appears when you are truly engaged and which disappears when you retreat into conventional courtesy. I would want to capture that moment of genuine engagement, that brief revealing of whoever exists beneath the Duke, because I suspect that is the version of yourself you recognize most clearly, even if the world sees it least frequently." The silence that followed her words seemed to stretch and thicken until it became almost tangible, and Eleanor became suddenly acutely aware that she had said far too much, had revealed observations that were inappropriate coming from someone of her station speaking to someone of the Duke's rank, had crossed boundaries that should have remained firmly in place, regardless of his apparent interest in her artistic perspective. But before she could stammer some apology or attempt to retreat from her boldness, the Duke smiled, not the polite social expression he had been employing throughout dinner, but something genuine and warm that transformed his face exactly as Eleanor had described, lighting his eyes with recognition and appreciation, and something else she could not name, but which made her breath catch in her throat. "I believe," he said quietly, his words clearly audible despite their softness, "that you are quite possibly the most perceptive person I have ever met, Miss Hartwell, and I find myself profoundly grateful that circumstances led me to discover you in that walled garden this afternoon, rather than allowing me to complete this visit in ignorance of your existence. I should very much like to see more of your portrait work beyond the single piece you showed me earlier." and I wonder if you might permit me to visit whatever space you use as your studio tomorrow morning, assuming such a visit would not disrupt your routine or make you uncomfortable with a relative stranger intruding on your private sanctuary. Eleanor glanced toward Lady Vivienne, seeking permission that she knew would not be granted, that could not possibly be granted, without her stepmother appearing unreasonably controlling or possessive before witnesses whose opinions mattered to her social standing and Rosalind's marital prospects. And indeed, Lady Vivienne smiled with false warmth and agreed that Eleanor might certainly show the Duke her modest artistic efforts, though she suggested that his Grace would likely find little of interest beyond what he had already observed, as Eleanor's lack of formal training meant her work remained necessarily primitive and unpolished compared to the accomplished portraiture he would have encountered in London galleries and aristocratic homes. But the Duke had simply thanked Lady Vivienne for her accommodation and returned his attention to Eleanor, asking her about subjects she hoped to paint if given access to better materials and formal instruction, about whether she had any interest in the great portrait artists whose work hung in museums and private collections, about what she believed made the difference between technically competent execution and genuine artistic vision that captured something essential about human character and experience. The conversation continued throughout the remainder of dinner, Eleanor gradually relaxing into genuine exchange with someone who treated her observations as valuable contributions rather than amusing oddities from an untrained amateur. And by the time the final course concluded and the ladies withdrew to the drawing room for tea while the gentlemen remained for port, Eleanor had experienced perhaps 3 hours of being treated as if she possessed intelligence and insight worthy of serious consideration, as if her thoughts mattered and her perspective added value to the gathering rather than simply being tolerated out of politeness toward a disadvantaged relation. The Duke had appeared the following morning at the walled garden, where Eleanor waited in a state of nervous anticipation, mixed with dread about what Lady Vivienne would say or do when this visit concluded. But for the moment, she allowed herself to simply exist in the experience of having someone genuinely interested in her, someone whose attention seemed focused and authentic, rather than polite or dismissive. She had gathered what pieces she could from the old potting shed, where she stored completed portraits and works in progress, spreading them across the stone bench and the nearby wall, so the Duke could examine them properly in the morning light that flooded the garden with golden illumination. He studied each portrait with focused attention, taking time to observe details and asking questions about her subjects and her process, about how she chose whom to draw and what she hoped to capture in each face, about the technical challenges she encountered working with limited materials and no access to the kind of formal instruction that would have taught her principles she was instead discovering through trial and error. His responses suggested genuine appreciation rather than conventional praise, and he pointed out specific elements that demonstrated natural talent, her ability to suggest volume and three-dimensionality through subtle shading, her skill at capturing the distinctive quality of individual expressions, the way she used negative space to focus attention on her subjects' faces rather than getting distracted by unnecessary background detail. "These should be seen by people who understand portraiture as an art form," he said finally, gesturing toward the collection of Eleanor's work that represented years of secret practice and determined effort despite every obstacle Lady Vivienne had placed in her path. "You possess genuine talent, Miss Hartwell, the kind that deserves development through proper training and exposure to great works that would teach you what is possible within the genre while still preserving the authentic vision that makes your work distinctive. Have you ever considered seeking formal instruction, or perhaps arranging to study the portrait collection at Thornwood Hall, which is considered one of the finest private collections in England?" Eleanor had laughed at that, a sound edged with bitterness she immediately regretted but could not entirely suppress. "I am afraid such opportunities are not available to someone in my circumstances, she said quietly, gathering her portraits back into the folder where she kept them hidden from Lady Vivienne's destructive impulses. "My father wished for me to have proper artistic training and set aside funds for that purpose, but after his death, those funds were redirected toward my stepsister's education and accomplishments, which Lady Vivienne quite reasonably considered more important than indulging my artistic pretensions. I paint because I cannot help painting, because something in me requires the attempt to capture what I see in faces, even when I know my efforts are primitive and my lack of formal training limits what I can achieve. But I harbor no illusions about my work representing anything more than the amateur efforts of someone with natural inclination, but no real skill or training to transform that inclination into genuine artistic accomplishment. "I think you underestimate your own abilities," the Duke said gently, "and I think perhaps your circumstances have taught you to view yourself through your stepmother's dismissive lens, rather than recognizing your own value independent of her assessment. But Miss Hartwell, Eleanor, if I may be permitted such familiarity, I wonder if you might allow me to propose something that could significantly change your situation. Something that would require courage on your part, but which might open possibilities you have learned not to hope for, because hoping seemed to lead only to disappointment and pain." Before he could continue, before Eleanor could respond to this mysterious proposal or understand what he intended, Lady Vivienne's voice cut through the garden's peace with the sharp clarity of a blade, and both Duke and stepdaughter turned to find her standing in the gateway with an expression that promised consequences Eleanor would spend weeks regretting. "Your Grace," Lady Vivienne said with false warmth that barely concealed her fury, "I am afraid I must interrupt your conversation with Eleanor, as I have just remembered that she has important household duties requiring her immediate attention. I am sure you understand that we cannot allow our domestic routines to be disrupted even for such distinguished company, and Eleanor has responsibilities that cannot be neglected simply because she has been enjoying your generous interest in her modest artistic efforts." The Duke had straightened to his full height, his expression transforming into something that combined aristocratic authority with barely suppressed anger, and when he spoke, his voice carried unmistakable command despite its continued courtesy. "Lady Vivienne, I must confess, I find myself increasingly concerned about Miss Hartwell's circumstances in this household, particularly given what I have learned from your butler, Mr. Pembroke, about the disposition of funds her father set aside specifically for her artistic education. I understand that family finances can be complicated and that sometimes difficult choices must be made about resource allocation, but I find it troubling that money explicitly designated for one purpose has been redirected without apparent concern for the wishes of the deceased or the rights of his daughter to receive the education he intended for." Lady Vivienne had paled at this revelation, her eyes flying to where Mr. Pembroke stood just visible in the corridor beyond the walled garden, and her fury at the old butler's betrayal was palpable even from a distance. "I'm afraid you have been misinformed, Your Grace," she said with strained composure. "Mr. Hartwell's will left general funds for his daughter's welfare, and I have exercised my judgment as her guardian to determine how those funds might best be deployed to ensure Eleanor's ultimate well-being. Artistic training seemed less essential than ensuring she possessed practical skills that would serve her throughout her life, particularly given her delicate constitution and her general unsuitability for the kind of demanding training a serious artistic education would require." "I see," the Duke said quietly, and those two words carried more weight than a lengthy denunciation could have communicated. "Well, Lady Vivienne, I find myself in the fortunate position of being able to offer Miss Hartwell opportunities that do not depend upon family resources or guardianship decisions, opportunities that would allow her to develop her considerable natural talent while also removing her from circumstances that appear to be constraining her potential in ways I find increasingly difficult to ignore or dismiss as merely family matters beyond my concern." He had turned then to address Eleanor directly, his expression serious, but his eyes holding something that looked like hope, or perhaps determination. "Miss Hartwell, I wonder if you would consider accepting a position at Thornwood Hall as artist in residence, a role that would involve cataloguing and maintaining my family's portrait collection, while also allowing you time and resources to pursue your own work under the guidance of accomplished portraitists I could arrange to instruct you. The position would come with appropriate compensation and accommodation, and it would free you from the limitations of your current circumstances while allowing you to develop your art in ways that seem impossible under present arrangements. I realize this is a rather extraordinary offer to make after such a brief acquaintance, and I would not want you to feel pressured into accepting something that makes you uncomfortable, but I hope you will at least consider the possibility before dismissing it as impractical or inappropriate." Eleanor had stared at him in complete shock, unable to process what he was offering, unable to believe that he was proposing to remove her from Ashford Manor and Lady Vivienne's control, and the entire nightmare of her life for the past 12 years, unable to trust that this was genuine, rather than some elaborate performance designed to humble Lady Vivienne, or prove some point about aristocratic generosity that would evaporate once the Duke returned to London and forgot about the sad stepdaughter with her charcoal portrait. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Why would you do this? You don't know me beyond a few hours of conversation and a handful of primitive portraits that any competent artist could produce with proper training. Why would you offer me such extraordinary opportunities when you could hire any number of accomplished portraitists to manage your collection, and when my presence in your household would likely cause scandal, or at least comment about the Duke of Thornwood harbouring some poor relation in questionable circumstances? Because," the Duke said with quiet intensity, "in 2 days of observation, I have seen more authentic passion and genuine talent in you than I have encountered in years of exposure to accomplished artists who possess every technical skill, but who have somehow lost or never possessed the ability to see clearly, to observe with genuine attention, to capture something essential about human character rather than simply rendering superficial features with mechanical precision. And because I recognize when someone possesses potential that is being systematically suppressed by circumstances beyond their control, and I find I cannot in good conscience leave you in a situation where such potential will continue to be wasted, simply because I lack the courage to offer alternatives that might seem unconventional or inappropriate by narrow social standards that I have never particularly valued in any case." Lady Vivienne had attempted to intervene, to prevent this conversation from reaching any conclusion that would remove Eleanor from her control and thereby eliminate her useful servant and convenient target for frustrations that could not safely be directed at anyone with power to resist or retaliate. But the Duke had silenced her with a look that communicated unmistakable authority, and he had continued addressing Eleanor with focused intensity that suggested this mattered to him in ways she could not understand, but which felt genuine despite the impossibility of the entire situation. "I am offering you a life, Miss Hartwell," he said quietly, "not rescue, because rescue implies helplessness, and I suspect you are far stronger than circumstances have allowed you to demonstrate, but rather opportunity, the chance to develop your talent, to pursue your art with proper resources and instruction, to build a life that belongs to you rather than existing as appendage to someone else's story. And if I'm being entirely honest, I am also offering this because I find your company intellectually stimulating and your perspective refreshing in ways I have not encountered in my usual social circles, and because I believe having you at Thornwood Hall would enrich my life as much or more than such arrangement might benefit yours. So please, Eleanor, consider accepting this offer not out of desperation to escape your current circumstances, though that would certainly be understandable motivation, but rather because you recognize that you possess genuine talent worthy of development, and that I am sincere in my belief that you could contribute meaningfully to the preservation and appreciation of an important portrait collection, while also creating work that might someday hang in galleries and private homes throughout England. Eleanor had looked at Lady Vivienne's furious face, at the Duke's earnest expression, at the portraits scattered across the stone bench representing years of secret practice and determined effort despite every obstacle placed in her path, and she had felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, some decision forming that terrified her even as it filled her with the first genuine hope she had experienced since her father's death 12 years earlier. "I accept," she heard herself say. The words emerging before caution or fear could silence them, before she could catalogue all the reasons this was dangerous or foolish or likely to end badly. "I accept your offer, Your Grace, with profound gratitude and the sincere hope that I will prove worthy of your confidence and your generosity in extending such extraordinary opportunities to someone whose only credentials are natural inclination and years of secret practice with inadequate materials." Paul. The Duke had smiled then with obvious relief and pleasure, and he had taken her hand, scandalously, without gloves or chaperone, or any of the proper forms that should have governed such interaction between unmarried persons of opposite sex, and raised it to his lips in a gesture that communicated more than words could adequately express. "You will leave with me tomorrow when my visit concludes," he said firmly, brooking no argument from Lady Vivienne, whose protests had begun immediately upon Eleanor's acceptance. "Mr. Pembroke will assist you in packing whatever belongings you wish to bring, and I will make arrangements with my solicitor to investigate the disposition of your father's will and determine whether funds designated for your education might be recovered and restored to their intended purpose. now that you will be in a position to actually receive the training Mr. Hartwell. The departure the following morning had been tense and fraught with Lady Vivienne's barely suppressed fury, and Rosalind's bewildered tears at having been thoroughly overshadowed by her plain, unaccomplished stepsister, who had somehow captured the Duke's attention and his offer of employment when Rosalind herself had been rejected as insufficiently interesting, despite her beauty and her carefully cultivated accomplishments. Eleanor had packed her few belongings with Mr. Pembroke's assistance, including her mother's dresses and her father's handkerchief, and every scrap of portrait work she had created over years of secret practice, and she had walked out of Ashford Manor without looking back, without permitting herself to feel anything beyond numb determination to escape before Lady Vivienne found some means of preventing her departure, or the Duke changed his mind about his impulsive offer to a girl he barely knew. The journey to Thornwood Hall had taken 2 days, and throughout that time the Duke had treated Eleanor with scrupulous propriety, while also engaging her in genuine conversation about art and observation, and all the things they had discussed in the walled garden, making clear through word and deed that his interest in her was multifaceted. Certainly, he valued her potential as an artist and her abilities as someone who could contribute to maintaining his portrait collection. But there was also something else, some personal interest that went beyond professional assessment, and which Eleanor did not quite know how to interpret or respond to, given the vast gulf in their stations and the improbability of anything developing between a duke and a former stepdaughter who possessed nothing beyond natural talent and years of suppressed hope, finally given permission to emerge into light. Thornwood Hall proved to be everything Eleanor might have imagined an aristocratic residence should be, vast and beautiful, and filled with treasures accumulated over generations, including the portrait collection the Duke had mentioned, which occupied an entire wing, and which represented centuries of aristocratic faces captured by artists, ranging from competent to masterful. The Duke had given Eleanor rooms in a section of the house reserved for honoured guests, rather than relegating her to servants' quarters, and he had arranged for accomplished portraitists from London to visit and assess her work, and begin providing the formal instruction her father had wished her to receive. And within weeks, Eleanor found herself living a life so different from what she had known at Ashford Manor that she sometimes woke in the night, convinced it must be dream or delusion that would evaporate when morning came. But morning always came, and the dream proved solid, sustained by the Duke's genuine interest in her development and his obvious pleasure in her company, by conversations that ranged from technical discussions of portraiture to philosophical inquiries about art and what made human faces so endlessly fascinating to those who bothered to look carefully at. And slowly, gradually, Eleanor began to understand that the Duke's interest in her extended beyond professional assessment or charitable impulse, that he genuinely valued her perspective and her company in ways that suggested possibilities she had learned not to hope for, but which now seemed to be emerging with terrifying and exhilarating inevitability. 6 months after Eleanor arrived at Thornwood Hall, the Duke had found her in the portrait gallery, where she often worked on her own pieces while studying the great works that surrounded her, and he had asked with unusual formality whether she might grant him a few moments of her time for a conversation of some importance. Eleanor had set aside her charcoal and paper and given him her full attention, noting the tension in his shoulders and the careful way he seemed to be choosing words before speaking them, and she had felt her heart begin to pound with anticipation, mixed with fear about what he might be about to say. "I have been thinking," he began carefully, "about how to express something that has been occupying my thoughts with increasing frequency over these past months, something that I suspect may be obvious to everyone except perhaps to you, who have learned through painful experience not to expect or hope for things that seem improbable or unlikely, given the circumstances of your birth and your history. I have been thinking about how much richer my life has become since you arrived at Thornwood Hall, how much more interesting and genuine my days feel when they include conversations with someone who sees clearly and thinks deeply and possesses the courage to speak honestly, even when honesty might seem inappropriate or unwelcome." He had moved closer to where Eleanor sat frozen in her chair, her hands gripping the arms with white-knuckled intensity as she tried to understand what he was saying and where this conversation might be leading. "I have been thinking," he continued, his voice dropping to something more intimate, "about the difference between the life I was living before you arrived, comfortable and privileged, but somehow empty, despite all its advantages, and the life I find myself living now, which feels full and purposeful in ways I had not experienced since I was much younger, and still believed that my position and my wealth might somehow translate into genuine happiness, rather than simply providing comfortable isolation from most of life's difficulties. He knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his with gentle strength, and when he spoke again, his voice carried absolute sincerity. I am not offering you employment anymore, Eleanor. I am offering you partnership, genuine partnership in every sense that word can carry. I am asking you to marry me, to become my wife and my duchess, and the person with whom I build a life that matters beyond the performance of aristocratic duties and the maintenance of family legacy. I am asking you to take a risk on someone who has recognized in you everything he hoped to find, but had stopped believing existed: intelligence and passion and authentic vision, and the courage to pursue what matters despite every obstacle placed in your path by people who should have protected and nurtured you. Eleanor had stared at him through tears that blurred her vision and made his beloved face waver and shift in the afternoon light, and she had tried to speak, but found her voice trapped somewhere in her throat, behind emotions too large and complex to express through mere language. "You cannot mean this," she finally managed. "You are a duke, and I am nothing, no one, the unwanted stepdaughter of a woman who spent 12 years teaching me that I possessed no value beyond whatever utility my labor might provide. You could marry anyone, women of rank and fortune who would bring advantages to your house and your name, women who possess beauty and accomplishments and all the qualities that make suitable duchesses. Why would you choose me when I bring nothing to this marriage except a talent for drawing faces and years of accumulated damage from circumstances you witnessed only briefly, but which shaped every aspect of who I have become? I would choose you," the Duke said fiercely, "because you possess something infinitely more valuable than rank or fortune or conventional beauty, something that cannot be taught or acquired through any amount of training or expense. You possess authentic vision, Eleanor, the ability to see clearly and think deeply and speak honestly, even when honesty requires courage, the capacity to recognize what matters beneath the surface performances that most people mistake for reality. You see me, Eleanor Hartwell, in ways no one else ever has or possibly ever will, and I find that I cannot imagine building a life with anyone who does not possess that particular gift of clear sight, who cannot distinguish between the Duke and the man, and who does not care more about the latter than the former." "Yes," Eleanor whispered, the word emerging before fear or caution could prevent it, before she could catalogue all the reasons this was improbable or inappropriate, or likely to end badly despite his obvious sincerity. "Yes, I will marry you, James Thornwood, not because you are a duke or because you have given me opportunities I never dared hope for, but because in the 6 months I have known you, I have come to love the person you are beneath the title and the performance, the man who sees clearly and values honestly and possesses the courage to choose partnership over isolation, even when such choice seems unconventional by narrow social standards. Yes, I will marry you, and I will spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of the love you have offered me and the future you have made possible, simply by being willing to see me when I had learned to believe myself invisible." He had pulled her into his arms then, holding her with fierce tenderness while she wept against his shoulder, and Eleanor had understood in that moment that her stepmother's cruelty had not been able to destroy something essential in her, that 19 years of being taught she was nothing had not actually made her nothing, that authentic worth existed, independent of external validation, and that sometimes being seen by the right person at the right moment could transform an entire life if one possessed sufficient courage to accept possibilities that seemed impossible until they suddenly, miraculously, became real. They married 3 months later in a quiet ceremony at Thornwood Hall, Eleanor wearing her mother's green silk and carrying a bouquet of wildflowers from the walled garden at Ashford Manor that Mr. Pembroke had carefully preserved and sent as his wedding gift, and afterward Eleanor had hung her portrait of the elderly woman from the village market in the portrait gallery, alongside works by masters, claiming space for her own vision among the great artists whose techniques she had studied, and whose standards she aspired to meet, while never losing the authentic observation that had first attracted the Duke's attention on that afternoon, when he glimpsed her painting in the garden and recognized something worth knowing worth preserving, worth choosing over conventional perfection that possessed technical skill but lacked genuine vision. And years later, when Eleanor's portraits hung in galleries throughout England, and her work was sought by collectors who valued authentic observation over merely competent execution, when she had students of her own, to whom she taught not just technique, but the importance of seeing clearly and thinking deeply and having courage to capture truth, even when truth conflicted with convention, she would sometimes think back to that morning when Lady Vivienne destroyed her self-portrait and commanded her to remain invisible during the Duke's visit, and she would understand that being forced into invisibility had somehow prepared her to be seen, that learning to observe from the margins had taught her to see what others missed, and that her stepmother's cruelty, while devastating, had ultimately failed to destroy the essential self that emerged when someone finally bothered to look carefully at what Lady Vivienne had worked so hard to conceal.